Hello, everyone, and welcome again to a Working Class Revolt, live number 57. And tonight we are interviewing another fellow Australian comrade, Joe Montero. Joe, how are you today?
I'm good.
Hmm,
I'm good at resting a little bit on a long weekend.
fair enough. And also, too, welcome also my fellow comrade in arms and fellow fighter and truck driver and outright top bloke. Please welcome Dust James.
Hello, comrade. No place I'd rather be. It is a nice, breezy, cold evening out here in rural North Carolina.
And I believe actually you guys have been hitting a major snowstorm or something, I'm
Mm.
led to believe, on the East Coast. So looking at weather reports. Well, look, just some formality work in Australia also too. I'll just acknowledge country as well that we're broadcasting here from the land of the Jar Jar Rarong, but obviously this has been broadcast from many other lands as well. And I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present, and also acknowledge that the struggle of the first people was a struggle against invasion of their lands and an anti-colonial struggle, which now is part of a broader struggle against imperialism. Well, as I said tonight, we are having an interview with Joe Montero, a long-time comrade, very active person in the working class as well, been involved in many a campaign. So it's a great opportunity. I've known him for now for the last 3 years. I think started with the Latin American Solidarity Network, and vice versa, through to I think many other campaigns as well. So I'll open it up to you, Joe. So just to give you some of our some background to.
Yeah, I will. But first, I'd like to mention, because I did say it's a long weekend, it's our Labor Day
Mm.
here, and it's really important, although the other side have captured it and turned it into quite a farce. It marked the world's first winning of the 8-hour day in 1856. Well, so we were there, and it didn't come because it was handed over. There was a long battle, and it was the heart were workers in the construction industry, and anyway, they organised a strike one day after years of campaigning, and just about everybody joined in from all over the place, and within days, the 8-hour day was won across the board in the state of Victoria. That was the first place in the world that happened. So myself, I became active when I was still in high school. The Vietnam War induced it, and I discovered Marxism fairly quickly, and was organising high school students against the war. That branched out to other things. After I left school, I became a worker in factory work. Eventually ended up going to university to study economic theory, and so I've got a degree, postgraduate study, and I began to study Marxist economics in a much deeper sense. And it took years. It took a couple of decades really to get a real grasp on it. It's not that easy. It takes some effort, but it can be done. Uh, my experience has also been in a variety of campaigns, political organisations, and also trade union work. I did spend a little bit of time as an official of one union, which ended through the process when the union went too far as the state was concerned, and got deregistered. It's a Builders Labourers Federation. One of the key areas that I've been active is opposing the control, the dominance, economic, political dominance of the United States over Australia. That our sovereignty is compromised as a result. That's been an ongoing issue, and our moving further as a society from where we are now depends on assuming control over our resources and our destiny. Outside that, I've been involved in education battles. Certainly, one was big one. We had a great victory, although at considerable cost, around the closure of schools and the privatisation of education. Also played quite a role in the opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. But I've also become increasingly concerned that our tradition, particularly the communist tradition, but extending to the broad definition of the left, have for a long time left the rails and have lost their vision, lost unity, and lost really a sense of where they're about. And I think the issue of the Ukraine encapsulates all that. The confused and all over the place response is really the result of an ongoing failure of direction that comes from, I think, a couple of factors. One is the victory of the other side during the Cold War. In many ways, the illusions that capitalism has overcome the problem of crisis that emerged in the 1950s, and I think also both of those conspired really to destabilize communist parties around the world, and sow divisions, and so different factions going on to different tangents. Now, I came in on the tailgate of that, and I was involved that, and as part of the Marxist-Leninist movement. Although I have moved on in some respects, I still respect a lot of the old comrades, but not only in one organisation. I think we need to do that. We need to understand that we're all looking for the answer. We need to find ways to build bridges, but we also need to find ways to connect with the working class in particular. And we need to encourage, because I think one thing that I've found problematic, that is a lot of the parties that consider themselves communist parties, socialist parties, have become, should we say, centres of the intelligentsia, disconnected from the working class. So at the moment, it's one of the issues that I'm concerned about, that I'd write about, I like to talk about whenever I can, and play a bit of a role there. So I think I'm talking too much, so I'll leave it to you guys.
That's fine. Well, actually, there was a couple of things I want to raise. Actually, you mentioned the union movement, the BLF, or otherwise known as Builders Labourers Federation, a legendary union. It's now part of CFMU, Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union. During that time, Builders Labourers were certainly an inspiration for us. They took a lot of leading roles, not just for wages and conditions and workplace safety and tidying up the building industry, but many social causes such as the preservation of heritage buildings, and actually basically taking the construction capital head on, really. And that, could you actually talk a little bit about your experiences in the Builders Labourers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. I mean, the builders labourers, as the name suggests, with the builders, I should say, within the industry, for a long time, the unionisation had concentrated around the trades, who historically were not keen on the labourers organising, because it would be a threat to the relativities, the position of the trades people. And they organised anyway, eventually, and formed their own union. And the labourers were not allowed to join the other unions within the industry. They were kept out as a matter of policy. But it turned out that they, particularly when its leadership became more assuredly communist leadership, that the union's greatest achievement was in organising its members, but not just organising in the basic way of, right, we need to organise to get better wages and conditions, but we need to discover pride in who we are. And the result, and it still lives on, that if you're a builder's labourer, you advertised it everywhere. I'm a builder's labourer. You wore the logos, you talked about it, and it connected the workers. This pride in who they are connected the workers. And to me, there was a great lesson in that. It's a great lesson in the union, and one that needs to be discovered. It's all right to be a worker. It's not something you hide. It's something you've got to be proud of. And that brings you together and starts forming a bit of a vision of what's possible. So that legacy still continues. Where the union got itself into trouble is that a new government, Labor Party government, which is something that a bit, but not the same, but something a bit like the Democrats in the US, except more of a conscious social democratic position, continued the battle to wreck the union. And we got a Prime Minister called Bob Hawke, who happened to be the head of our union federation, Australian Council of Trade Unions, who made it a sacred mission of his and his mate, because his closest friend at the time really was Rupert Murdoch. We also know since that he was an operative of the Central Intelligence Association of the United States, the CIA. And he, under the Hawke government, two related things were put in. Corporatisation came in, and so did neoliberalism as a solution to aspects of capitalist crisis, under the name of the Prices and Incomes Accord. It was used as a vehicle to crush union organisation, to keep the share workers got down, actually go the other way, and to use trade union structures as a vehicle to police this. It caused considerable damage to our movement. And when eventually they lost office, Labor lost office to get our equivalent of the Republicans, the Liberal Party, strange names, they continued along the same path. But a lot of what's happened over the last 2 decades or 3 decades began under a Labor government, and there was a battle over this, and it still hasn't been won. But at this moment, we have had a considerable loss of trust from the Labor Party's political base. Working class people no longer trust that. The base of the other side have gone the same way, gone probably even a little bit further. Now, we're about to have an election, national election. And I'd say that the most likely outcome of this is that neither side will be able to govern on their own. They will be forced in a position of becoming a minority government. And that's because of this, because we have a growing segment of the population, which includes a growing section of the working class, who take the attitude is, I don't want either of the bastards. They know this, and they claim, and their spokespeople lament from their point of view. They call this a turning away of society from the values of democracy. And what we've got to say, no, it's the opposite. They're calling for democracy, and they see they're not getting it. So that's a situation. The union movement has got the task. It's still considerable in Australian society, but it faces the task of rebuilding but not only rebuilding with a bit of a different understanding. There are elements of that because most union leaderships, like most of their members, don't want to advertise that they're too close to the Labor Party. So their slogans around anybody but them, anybody but the Liberals, basically. Would you agree with that, Dave? That's what you're hearing around anybody but them. They know that they can't, and some of them are genuinely fed up, but they also know that they can't sell. Look, support the Labor Party. So that's the situation we've got now, and I hope that explains the role briefly of the Builders Labourers Federation. That to bring this system in, I should have added, to bring this accord system in, they had to get rid of the Builders Labourers Federation as an organised force.
Yeah.
That's why it happened, and they also were able to push this through because they managed to convince a section of the left that this would be a good thing, this accord, because they told them, look, if you clamp down, if you hold down the battle for better wages, then we will be the government and we will give you all sorts of benefits. We'll increase the welfare state. So that will cover that. So you'll get your wage increases through another means. Those of us who argued against it said, yeah, fair enough that they say that, but they're not going to implement it. They have no intention. And this is exactly what happened. And some people should have known this.
Yeah, and actually that's a really good point you point out. For those of you who are overseas, or maybe even younger viewers, understand in 1983, Bob Hawke was elected in as the Prime Minister of Australia, the Labor government, after, I think, 7 years of Conservative rule. No, 8 years. Apologies there. He believed in the consensus model, and through that, with the help of the ACTU and other unions, brought in a policy called the Prices and Incomes Accord. Which was basically to tie the Labor movement or union movement to government policy. In exchange, we were supposed to have Medicare, which we got Medicare, superannuation, you other things, and forego pay rises and that. But at the same time, it actually was the deliberate breaking down of union power in this country as well. Just didn't happen overnight. This was a gradual thing. The Builders Labourers Federation, or otherwise known as the BLF, or the BLs, was primarily in the eyesight because it knows it was a super militant union. They achieved many great things both socially and industrially as well, but also too the militancy in other sections of the workforce at the time. We had big strikes all over from the mid-'80s onwards. We had from the Mudgeonberry abattoir dispute, which copped the meat workers union massive fines, plumbers union, certain industrial activity that copped them, nearly sent them bankrupt with massive fines. The busting of the unions in the Pilbara, it started with the Robe River dispute in 1986, which was the iron ore mining sector was highly unionised, but that was the first to break down union power as well, both by big business and the banks, etc., but also in cahoots with the governments at the time. And some people say the irony, the Labor governments at the time as well, that was supposed to protect, supposedly supposed to protect the interests of workers, but it obviously didn't. So, and you can see now where we are in this country with low rates of union density. I think we're about 15% of the whole entire workforce. Most of the public sector is a more unionised sector. But even that, so the fact is, the real power on the ground is where workers and unions are usually the blue collar commodity producing one, be it all that sector from the construction, the mining sector, manufacturing, but also to the transport industry and that. Because if one of those industries stop, basically capital stops. Where public service, I'm not knocking public servants, but if they stop, capital still keeps going. So it's an interesting way, an analysis. Someone told me that the other day, and I thought, yes, that sounds about right, why they did it. And basically now, any employers out there, they are scared of a fully unionised workforce again because they know what will happen. Everything will just stop. Production will stop. The truck drivers in Canada, when they stopped, everything stopped. You know what I mean? It's in a lot of ways part of the production line. If you look at the transport section, if you look from from that view of it, and from political economy view, even that's part of the big production line. So it's not just the factory; it's the transport to the port, etc. A consistent production line moving around. And even part of that section of that production line closes, or shuts down, or stops, or the whole lot of it, capital is threatened. So some thoughts on there. Dust, did you want to ask anything?
Okay, I'm on. Can y'all hear me?
Yes. Yep.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Brother Joe, for sharing your story there. Maybe if I could just respond quickly. From the United States. I'm a little younger, and I came up, a little later time period. Became politicized around the Iraq War. But I really came up in the shadow of a lot of the events that you were describing, and there was a lot of similar things that happened in the United States. I think a big difference between Australia and the United States was the intensity of the McCarthy era in the United States. It basically destroyed any remnant of the Communist Party. A lot of it either went underground or became weak and isolated. I know the socialist and communist parties continued to be a major part of the union movement in Europe and Australia. That wasn't the case here. I'm into the transportation industry. I'm a truck driver, and let's see, one of the biggest unions was the Teamsters, and he was trained by the Trotskyites out in Minneapolis, in the Midwest, and he actually had some more right-wing leanings as well as some corruption with the union, with the mafia and organized crime, but there was still workers' power. It was still a legitimate powerhouse. And Kennedy and the liberals and others destroyed Jimmy Hoffa, destroyed the power of the union. What was left of the union? Reagan in the if we got there was actually a good thing here by Kiki. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Kiki, shout out to Kiki. We had Ronald Reagan, who became a national scab when the air traffic controllers went on strike. And I remember my jaw dropping to my knees. And that was a big issue. And what a lot of people in the 1940s, there was we had one of the biggest communist forces in the world with the Communist Party. Gus Hall, and then earlier go back to William Z. Foster. And that whole legacy was erased. I was taught by people just a little bit older than yourself, whose parents were dragged out of their houses and tortured during the McCarthy era. And I was taught that older school kind of communism, where communism was still linked to the working class. And now it's not. And as you described earlier, it's really just social groups that are in and hooked to the liberal intelligentsia with no real mass working class understanding. And because I was able to get some training from older comrades and still be able to have that legacy, and they were underground and isolated, I think because of the labor aristocracy and the political, the height of the labor aristocracy was 1968. And then we had Reagan and McCarthyism that really destroyed the labor aristocracy, destroyed the labor movement. And then you had the rise of neoliberalism, which started with Reagan. But what a lot of the left refused to admit is that Clintonism was the extension, was the emboldenment and the expansion of Reaganism. And then we've had, a downward spiral for a while. And now I think this is what this show is. Working Class Revolt is really that reemergence of the old left. A reason why I call myself a Marxist-Leninist trucker is because you don't hear about working class communists no more. And I think we're making a comeback. We're making a reemergence, and we have to fight tooth and nail against this entity that calls itself the left. Sorry, I respond any way you want to respond. Go ahead, brother Joe.
Yeah. If I can, because the whole McCarthy thing, we had it here too.
Mm.
Before that started, the Communist Party of Australia was easily the biggest political party in the nation in terms of membership. It was a lot of Labor Party rank and file member supporters were turning to the Communist Party. It dominated every union, you could say, in the country, just about every union. And in the peak of that, it was declared illegal. The Communist Party of Australia was made illegal. There was a 3-year battle on that. That was just before, a little bit before my time, but some of the people who came before, I got it from them, some of the details. And I knew some of the people who were involved in organising that campaign and told me, the people getting meetings being crashed by thug gangs, beating people up. Speakers somewhere out there, people coming through doing that. The police being used constantly against them. There was one battle here in Melbourne where I am, and one part it was called the Free Speech Movement, and a key speaker, leader of the Communist Party, eventually got locked in a giant birdcage so he wouldn't be arrested. But he ended up, after that happened, he ended up getting a bullet in the backside later on. There is a monument there at that spot with a little concrete bird cage signifying that. It's the Free Speech Monument. So all these things did happen, but it was not only the physical, the intense ideological assault that you were a traitor, you worked for the Russians, you're a Russian agent if you were labelled a communist. Then we had the Petrov case where they got an underling within the Russian embassy, and it came out after, and people knew. They tried to frame up a group of people who've been aspiring, a communist Russian aspiring, sounds familiar. And it went to court. The evidence was so ridiculous, it had to be thrown out of court. Now, this Vladimir Petrov, turned out to be not only opportunist, a drunk who had a particular fondness for prostitutes. He was supplied with a good measure. He thought he'd landed in paradise. He was offered perpetual prostitutes, lots of booze, and lots of money. And if he would turn witness against the Russians. Of course, he did that, and after it was all over, they didn't want to know him. They did change his name, and he lived in secret, but he didn't have what he was promised. And he died a very bitter man. And his wife, a few years later, who the evidence is wanted to go back to the Soviet Union, but she was forcefully detained at the airport and were claimed that the Russians were trying to kidnap her. She was silenced. So that was used as a major propaganda thing, and it just continued. The Labor Party was split by CIA-connected intrusion into the Labor Party, and it was kept out of government for a long time. But it caused a similar sort of damage. And I think the Cold War, although it's often said it was directed against Russia or the Soviet Union, as it was then, yes, it was in part. But I think the real target, the most important target, was domestic communist and communist organisation. And that's even today not properly understood, I don't think. And we need to look back at what happened then, and maybe we've entered into a new similar period. We need to learn the lessons of the past and find out ways to fight the sort of McCarthyism, or the new form of McCarthyism, which is emerging. We need to find ways to fight it better. Because I'm quite sure there are going to be similar setups before too long in the United States, in Australia, in the UK, various other countries.
Right on. Yeah, and look, obviously, we're seeing what's happening now these days, especially in the situation with the Ukraine. People putting an alternative view, being called people like being, oh, you're a supporter of Putin, you're a Putinite. I've heard all sorts of extraordinary things out there, and that's just putting it lightly. They're actually horrible. No, they're not extraordinary. They're actually outright horrible names as people as well. And of course, now I'm seeing the confusion amongst a lot of circles about it, about the situation, and it's done deliberately, obviously. And I looked at also the history of the communist movement here in this country as well. And it was done deliberately. It played on the differences and caused us to split, but even further putting comrades against each other. But at the same time, introduced new ideologies. We called the new left here, new left ideologies, or it's other one, synthetic left, and basically abandoned the working class base. So by the time even the original Communist Party, when it liquidated in 1991, became this new left project, whatever. You could just see then it was so far removed from the working class, from everyday ordinary reality of workers, that it's a tragic, but it's also a very important lesson to learn. As Chairman Ma once said, the best lessons learned are the hard ones, but we do need to learn that really significantly, and that's what based on what we've seen. And I'll put there's some good comrades in the current parties there at the moment too, and I know what they're trying to do, and they're trying to turn things around. That's why I don't really like hanging out there criticising them badly, but I need to point a couple of things out at the time, especially the positions of the communist parties on what's happening with the Ukraine at the moment, and especially using the term Russia's imperialist, not understanding imperialism has an economic basis. It's a material thing. It's not a policy. It starts from an economic basis. Russia hasn't got that economic basis to be imperialist by any means. Sure, it's a capitalist. Yeah, we can argue that, but I mean, yes, of course we could say that. But to actually say that the imperialist, well, no, they've obviously then got a very distorted view of what that is, or completely what actually everything's in they've completely forgotten that everything's in a constant state of change. Nothing's static and nothing's permanent. Did you want to comment on that a little bit further?
Yeah. Just going back first to some of the problems we had over the years with the whole McCarthy thing. After now, one thing that held things back in our favour, to some extent, was a battle over anti-union laws, which were called the penal powers, and unions just about doing anything. The employers would go to the court, we call it the arbitration court here, and they got an order. If they didn't obey, they got fined massive amounts, and the leadership were threatened with imprisonment. And there was a long battle, and it was planned over a period of 14 years. And an old comrade, sadly not with us, comrade of mine, a friend in actual fact, ended up being related family-wise. Called Clary O'Shea. Now, he was secretary of the Tramways Union. And what had happened, he got the short straw, because they got to a point that they thought a group of unions thought they'd developed their forces enough to take this on head on. So he got the short straw. And there was an industrial dispute, got fine ordered. He buried the money somewhere, the union's money, took it out of the bank in the meantime, and was ordered to pay or else be jailed indefinitely for contempt of court. He said basically to the judge, "You should be on trial." And he was arrested, he was locked up, and the country stopped within hours. It had been prepared to the ground that massive millions of workers around the country walked off the job. Many have attended huge marches across the nation, and they didn't know what happened. So what happened, the end of that was that we know now the contacts of the government decided to pay the fine in secret so they could get out, because they were terrified if this continued, what was going to happen. They feared revolution at the time. So these laws for a long time were made inoperative. They were not written off the books, but no government would dare use them because of the fear of a similar reaction again. So that was a proud moment for the working class. And it held back the assault from the ruling class to some extent. And it was really only the deterioration of economic conditions in the late 70s and the rise and the planting of people like Bob Hawke into positions of influence. It wasn't only him. There were other people in other areas too, and they played a real chess game, and they did it well. It was, as far as we know, the command headquarters was at the US Embassy in Canberra. And they did that. And the path, the path towards that was effectively a coup against the Labor government, the Gough Whitlam government that came in 72 and was overthrown by coup in 75. Hawke, the leader of the trade union movement, we know now, we suspected, we had a good idea at the time, played a key role in that, as well as organisations that were directly funded by the CIA in this country, like the Institute for Cultural Affairs was one of the major ones. So that shaped our situation as well. But the rot eroded, and I think one of the problems that we have, I think what you said, Dave, about the sections, the New Left, and that, I think that in itself, I think, was a reflection of the decline of the communist movement. That there were people who said, "Oh, look, it's not working. We've got to find a solution to this," and some went in that way. That was at the time when, in academia around the world, there was this push to say, no, Karl Marx's theory of value was not really right because capitalism has found the way to avoid the periodic crisis. They're on a perpetual growth, and we must we must save Marx from himself. I think it was one of the expressions used. And so all these books were published by academics who once called themselves, it still called themselves Marxists, became known as the post or neo-Marxist movement. And it had an effect because this was introduced into the communist movement, into the communist parties. Oh, it's not, capitalism's not like it was in the 19th and 18th centuries. We must update, which meant, in effect, to take on a kind of social democratic position. But it was itself a reflection of the decline because the communist movement had lost that battle that it began at Bretton Woods. And there was a failure. And I think one of the problems is those who did see there was a problem, they did not yet appreciate the full context. There was a movement against revisionism that I became part of. And I think that was, yes, the policies that came out during the Khrushchev years were not good, but there was a failure to go deeper, to go to the social base, the cause. Why did this happen? Why were we sucked in outside the Soviet Union, in some part, into believing that that a progressive capitalist government can institute socialism through legislation? Why did we accept these things? And that wasn't done. And I think, in a sense, that battle remained at a fairly superficial level. There's still a need to go deeper into it. And now we have, of course, we have a new generation. That came up at the end of the 1960s. It came up with their own sort of, I'll say almost new, and there were new age sort of things, a whole mixture of things. And again, taking on various other things, saying, oh, look, we'll save Marxism from Marxism by attaching all these other things to it. which in effect is kind of petty bourgeois liberalism. In reality, it's trying to. So, well, we can't defeat capitalism, we thought, because there's never going to be a revolution there. So we'll try to make it smile a bit. We'll put a happy face, a smiley face on capitalism, and that's we can do with that. But that's gotten nowhere. That's experience.
Wow, there's a lot to take in there, and it's a very important lesson to it. We really need to have a look at the whole situation further, know our past, and as well as vitally important. And it's, as I said, we can see today, there, I mean, it was obviously there was ways to really, break up the communist movement overall, which is interesting. By the end of 1945, the Communist Party of Australia was the biggest ever party ever Australia ever had. No other party, even what they call the major parties, Labor or Liberal National Coalition, they've never actually achieved the numbers in that like they ever did throughout the history. Interesting enough. So hence why too the powers that be actually thought, oh, we've got a problem here. We've got a Communist Party that constitutes the biggest party ever, and we need to do something about that. But it's obviously as soon as they take a good path and everything else, it's obviously the attacks intensify. So when there's the consistent both internal and external threats, the communist movement's always had to deal with. And I mean, look, even when my time in the Communist Party, either the CPA and that, I saw the differences as well. Some people just ideological misunderstandings, I think, on things. There was a lot of ideological confusion there as well. There was some good, and still are some good comrades there that do get it, and then I can understand they're trying to turn things around. They've got a more manageable task, and I like that comment Raymond said a little bit further. It's marathon, not a sprint, with all the decades worth of propaganda. Certainly is. It's also, it certainly is. Well, look, moving on a little bit. Hold on, Dust. Did you want to ask anything else?
Sure. Yeah, if I could just respond, I think what I really liked your comment about the loss of Australian sovereignty, and we're seeing that a lot now with the Ukraine situation, where Germany and France are being forced to pay high fuel prices because to stay in the imperialist coalition, they're essentially having to take loyalty oaths to Wall Street in London. There was recently truckers' strikes in France and Germany over rising diesel prices. And I think a lot of people in my area in rural America and in the South, when they constantly hear people saying, the CIA, the Americans did it. There's a little bit of a negative reaction, and I think it's unnecessary, because I think that this system is imperialism is monopoly capitalism, and with this further monopolization, with the rise of neoliberalism and others, we've seen a destruction of the working class community structures. We've seen a destruction of localized working class culture, music, and other things. As the monopolies have grown, the culture has become corporate. The societal structures have become corporate. The extended families have been stripped down. People have been moved around based on the changing economics, and now we're just tied. We work for the main monopoly companies, and we get everything we need from these monopolies, and we've had a loss of our own rights, cultural expression, and understanding. I mean, we have this, and our movements, the very left movement, the labor movement, what calls itself the left, has been attacked and infiltrated by the CIA here. What Caleb Maupin calls the synthetic left, is the synthetic left because the CIA has been, basically founded DSA and has been pushing these so-called neo-Marxist ideals. And then when the people came up and fought against it outright. Probably one of the best examples was the Panthers. They were shot in their beds. The brutal police force came. So if they can't co-opt you, then they outright kill you. And now we're seeing this this now with social media. We're lulled into this trap that we live in a democracy, that we have freedom of speech and we have all these rights. But now, as there's further hostilities against Russia. We're seeing RT was cut off of YouTube. Documentaries are being took down. People are being censored on Facebook. So I don't know. Maybe you could talk, given your experience that you've gone through, all these issues and the fights you've had. Maybe if you could just shed a little bit of wisdom in this current intensifying moment with hostilities towards Russia.
Yeah, just in the general question about question of democracy, what sort of society. One moment or one time had major impact on me is when I was in prison was involved in the anti-apartheid solidarity movement. It became big at the time, and anyway, I was in prison for a little while and got a first-hand view of the violence of the authorities. So, because anybody who's been and understand, it's not good in the United States that the prison system is really it's the iron fist in there. And so that was a wake-up call to me, and I decided to become a better Marxist. So, and this stuff I mentioned at the beginning, corporatization, because I think it goes together with neoliberalism. And we want to look at the history of that. The first person who actually put it together as a theory is Mussolini. And it's really what happened in the Third Reich and other countries in that time, right? In a particularly violent sort of form. But the idea is a belief that the way to manage society and keep it growing, keep the profits up, is to turn society into a corporation. It was Mussolini who said that the at work, when people go to work, management decides, and if the workers don't follow directives, then they lose their job. The idea was that society must operate in a similar way, that it must become a giant corporation. So that was it. That's what the prices and incomes are brought to this country. The two influences of Bob Hawke, in ideological terms, shall we say, were Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, because they were doing the same thing in their own respective turfs. So we need to understand that today, that if we want to fight neoliberalism, we need to fight corporatization. And I'd like to say that's been extended into the community sector, particularly those sections of the community sector that survive on government funding at some level. That's one of the conditions that gets imposed. You corporatize and operate in the same way. Take it away from the people. The committees of management that used to manage the organisation, they don't anymore. You turn that authority over to paid employees. Now, on the question of sovereignty, I think Australia has a particular history because it was founded as a set of British colonies that first of all involved the destruction of the economy of the Indigenous people and society of the Indigenous people. It was terrible. The largest part of the population was physically wiped out. But it also quite quickly emerged that those people who were coming here as settlers came here at a time when there were, mainly from Europe, where there were revolutionary upheavals. They wanted to get away from that, from the politics, the power of where they left behind. They wanted to start a new nation, a new life for themselves. And it ended up in the Eureka Uprising, the 1850s here in the gold fields. And I have to say, too, the first person killed was one of them, but I think at least two. I think there were more of those who participated were former slaves in the cotton fields in the southern United States. Sadly, the first one killed in the assault was one of them. He got a bullet in the head. But that set in traction, although it was a military slaughter, should we say, it set in traction a movement around the country for autonomy. We don't want to be part of the Crown. Ended up in federation and a kind of sort of, self-government and institutions. Because originally there was not even universal suffrage. You had to own substantial property to get the right to vote. But this movement changed these things. But there is, and I think a lot of us have said since then, there's unfinished business because we still dependent on the control of British finance capital. After the Second World War, United States finance capital, Wall Street, took precedence and set up new industries which they controlled. And it's still the case today. So in Australia's context is that there is not much of an indigenous, should we say, local capitalist class, since most of our industries, our banking system, what's left of our manufacturing, our service sector, our retail sector, and increasingly agriculture are owned by shareholders in New York and similar places. London's still there, but Wall Street controls our economy. So if we're going to move forward, we must pay attention to that. And one of the things is that we've got emerging in the political right also a demand to move away from the control of Wall Street. Right? It has other connotations to it as well, but it's something that's fairly broadly understood around the place. We still have, which gets used, we still have the British Queen as the head of state. We haven't been able to get rid of that. So, how can you be a democratic and a sovereign people if you do not have authority over your economy? And I like to say that our question of sovereignty involves that, but it also involves, I think, in parallel with the United States, the autonomy of the First Nations peoples. Because their problems will not be solved unless they are able to run their own affairs as well.
And I'm glad you actually brought that into the discussion as well, because we, with the First Nations people here in this country, we'd never signed a treaty with them. It was in 1967, there was a national referendum to actually recognise them as full citizens. But even that, they still had struggles after that, still do to this day, because even prior to that, they weren't entitled to property or anything like that. They were actually they were treated very appallingly.
Well, legally, they weren't even regarded as human beings. They were fauna.
Yeah,
and
that's
under
right.
that excuse, it was legal to kill indigenous people. And often did happen. And,
Yes.
it was like shooting a rabbit or a kangaroo in our case.
Yeah. Exactly. So, I mean, this is it's a lot of Australian history. It's interesting, Dust. I'm not sure if I commented to you, but or someone from else in the United States one time. We talked about the issue of slavery once, but I said, well, Australia's no saint in this either. We had slavery as well with the indigenous population, or we brought in the Pacific Islanders for the North Queensland cane fields. They weren't paid. They were pretty much enslaved by then too. So they were offered everything, but it was a form of slavery brought in. So, unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand the actual history of this country, the sense where, this is where our duty is to actually put it out there properly, what exactly happened, and understand, not to feel bad about ourselves or anything like that, but to actually understand it, learn from it, and say, well, no. But there's also the good side of it as well. There was actually an ongoing struggle to fight for our own sovereignty and get the hell out, and away from all this British establishment, but also the current imperialist establishment. So that's it's something it's still ongoing today, and actually interesting because we've actually Joe's one of the founders. We formed Australians for a New Democracy, which is your sister organisation to the Centre of Political Innovation. One of our catchphrases is life, sovereignty, peace, because that's in our interests. Not one. Have a good quality life for everybody, to our own sovereignty, so we can have our control of our own destination and control of the economy, but also peace as well, because it's not our interest to be backing any imperial war like we're constantly seeing now. It's because it's working class and poor people that are going to be suffering in big time, and it's in our interest to have peaceful relations with everybody, especially our immediate neighbours, and win-win cooperation. That was something I learned on that as well.
Could I just add
on
the question of slavery, because the first forms of embryonic capitalism that were established there after colonialisation was the slave labour of convicts who were sent out. And, and a high proportion of them were Irish Fenians, Irish nationalists, got to say, but also we had early trade union leaders who were repressed in the UK and some other places. But these prisoners were handed over to those who came and grabbed huge parcels of land as free labour, over which they had the power of a jailer. In other words, this free labour could be whipped for insubordination and could be hanged or shot if they tried to run away or tried to do a more serious infringement. So they weren't paid wages. They had to be given a bed. In other words, they got a piece of floor in a shed, and they had to be given some basic food. That was all they got. They were slaves. And that's been written out of history. It needs to be understood that it's not a case of those first people who came here oppressing the indigenous people. They were oppressed themselves. And in reality, it was that some of them did escape. And those who survived were those who escaped to areas still controlled by the indigenous people. And they became often part of the tribe. Because, one of the problems was they were so far away from their home country, the original country, they never had a chance to go back.
Yeah, and that's actually it's true. And a lot of that did happen as well. Actually, just on that, we were asked a question by Incisive. Is there an Australian equivalent to CIA, or do they fall under the umbrella of MI6 as a Commonwealth country? No, we have ASIO, Australian Security Intelligence Organisation. So that's the equivalent we have here, and they've obviously through them. That's just where a lot of things have happened.
Yeah, we've got to officially ASIO is supposed to be internal, a bit more like the FBI in the United States, but the borders are pretty blurred in reality. We also have ASIS, Australia Signals Information. I forgot the other one, and they're supposed to be the external arm. And there are a couple of other agencies that no one hears much about. One thing that did happen a couple of years ago, the current government decided to integrate them, and they set up a command centre to have them work more closely with each other. And they are pretty active. Not only are they active, they're stepping up their activity now.
Yep.
And there's a lot of people under surveillance at the moment, we understand. And I think they're also, ASIO is for the first time involved in the propaganda war, that officials are saying, the Russians want to conquer us, or the Chinese want to conquer us. And these become major media stories, right? It's true because our intelligence organization said so, so it must be true. and there's contact. Although there's divisions within that, because there are people in the camp who are actually starting to say, hang on, this is not the best way to handle it. It's fraught with dangers. We're getting that with the general staff and the military as well. Some of them are starting to say, hang on, this is a bit reckless. You're pushing a bit too far. There are dangers in it. So it'd be interesting. I think this contradiction will expand. But having said that, they are a very dangerous force in our society. And no doubt in the States, you're getting plenty of the same.
Very good. And just actually on that about our various security things, we also have Australian Federal Police as well. I'll just tell a little funny story how that was formed. There was a Prime Minister called Billy Hughes. He was a Labor Prime Minister during World War One, and he was supportive of World War One. He was going to. I wasn't too sure if he came up with a quote to the last man to the last shilling or something else
for the empire.
Yeah, for the Empire. Anyway, he was at the time on a break of gauge railway station on the Queensland-New South Wales border, and anyway, he was he was trying to address a crowd. It was a very angry crowd at the time before he had to change trains, and then anyway, the crowd started throwing eggs at him. Well, some people in the crowd started throwing eggs at him. Anyway, he instructed the Queensland police officer at the time, because it was just over on the Queensland side, to deal with these people and arrest these people. And the police officer turned around, I only answered to Queensland, son. And so infuriated he was, he had to be quickly rushed onto the next train down to New South Wales. But so infuriated he was that he actually legislated to form the Australian Federal Police to deal with this later on. But the irony, But the thing to the story is egg throwing to him became a popular pastime, even right up to the day of his funeral when he was lowered, his remains were lowered into the ground. People were still pelting eggs at his coffin, and even when it was lowered into the ground, people threw a few eggs in there before the first shot of soils turned off. So alas.
Yeah, postscript that is he lost office too, big time. Everyone turned against him. He... for a little while, he destroyed the Labor Party.
Yeah, he became ultra-conservative himself.
It was actually from that movement that led to the foundation of the Communist Party in the early 1920s. So it was, it was a major movement, because the anti-conscription movement was tied to the anti-war movement, where people have been sucked in. We have to go over there to save civilization and the empire, and people,
the king and empire,
and servicemen in particular, soon learnt that wasn't the case. And in fact, is that it was a lot of the founders of the Communist Party were ex-servicemen who'd gone through this horrible experience, which dawned on them that their leaders weren't all they were cracked up to be, and there was something wrong. Not only that, the servicemen had been promised land and all sorts of things when they came back. They came back and didn't get it, or those who did get it got land which was basically useless for agriculture, and they weren't happy about it. And so that's in parallel with the resumption of struggles of the working class itself at work and so on, that it led to the formation of the Communist Party, where a number of existing political groups merged together.
Yep. Actually, Joe, sorry, Joe, there was two other interesting bits of our history. In 1919, just off Fremantle in Western Australia there, it was during the height of a May Day campaign, but also there was a strike on the wharves, and there was actually where one of the wharf labourers was killed by the police. But there was crowds swarming onto the wharves there, supporting the striking workers against scabs and everything else, and horseshoes being thrown and all that. But off the coast, there was a ship of returned servicemen, and they were fully armed. Word got back to them what was going on, and what they wanted to do is, they were trying to mutiny on the ship, get it to shore so they can turn the guns against the police and support the striking workers. And that shows you, because they've seen what War One was really all about at the end of the day, and the experience that they go, no way, we're going to let this happen. They deliberately authorities managed to keep the ship offshore because they were worried about that. And then another note, one of the returned servicemen, an officer in the Anzacs, Hugo Throssell, Captain Hugo Throssell. He actually married prominent communist Catherine Susanna Pritchard, one of the founders of the CPA in Western Australia. Well, he actually was awarded the highest military honour, which is the Victoria Cross, and for his services and that. And so he was brought back, and I think it was about circa 1920. He was there to address a large crowd with the then Premier of Western Australia and all these other dignitaries and all this, all the pomp and ceremony around it. And obviously had all the speeches that. But when it came down to Captain Throssell, when he explained it, he says, and they were expecting him to put a proper conservative speech, but he says, I've seen the horrors of this war. I now know what it was all about. That's why I'm a card-carrying socialist. Right in front of everyone. And you can just imagine the whole aristocracy, the squatocracy and the top brass, and going, oh! And the Premier had a near heart attack and didn't know what to think when he said that crowd, but there was workers amongst the crowd, and the workers actually all cheered. They went, yay! Good on you. So you're one of us. So
Yeah,
it just comes to say.
Yeah, there were. I think on something else, I think one of the problems that we do face is connected has been, I think, the Hollywoodization of culture. It's really there. And one of the problems we have, and the younger people don't pick it up because they were born into it, is even our language is changing. There's a lot of I still use some of those expressions, and you do them in front of a teenager and, oh, what are you talking about? What language is that? That was our language. And increasingly, we're to use Hollywood language. Even the way we spell has been Americanized in our school system. That Indigenous culture and certainly homebred culture, non-Indigenous culture, is neglected. You see very little of it on our television, movies, in our records and so on. And there are brave souls who are swimming against the tide, and you say you get glimpses occasionally of that, but it's very hard. And I think it's because part of it is the corporate control over media, all forms of media, that imposes that. And we need to find, and I think one of the way forward for our movement, or a critical part of it, is that we need to pay attention to culture. We need to involve working people in the development of their own culture. And part of that has been the isolation of people. And one of the fears of the internet I think it's contributed in some ways towards it, is cutting people off from each other in a real sense. Because once upon a time, you knew your neighbours. You knew your workmates. You'd go out for a drink after work with your neighbours. It'd be social events. Now there's not much of that anymore. It's go to work, go home, fall asleep, occasionally get on the internet, and that interaction between people, it's not there. So we need to find ways to get people to interact again, because in the past, that was the major centre of organisation, is where people went. People talk a lot about the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks largely built their organisation around a network of what they call beer halls or bars, stuff where workers would go after work to talk about the problems at work. We used to have what we call the worker men's clubs, where union members would go after work, have a chat about work and what's wrong with the world and what they need to do. It was a tremendous centre of organising. And one of the things that were attacked during the McCarthyite era was that. The union movement through, or the Communist Party through the union movement, also set up training. They set up what were called mechanics institutes, where workers could go, union members could go after work, and they could learn, pick up a skill, learn to read and write, or learn about politics. They could enroll in courses. So both of these, the worker men's bars and mechanics institutes, were wiped off the scene.
Very good.
Had to get rid of them.
Yep.
And we've got to go back to that, I think.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, no, build our base up again. Now, Dust, did you want to ask? Oh, sorry, Joe.
Yeah, I could just say, why should we rely on the institutions of the class enemy to train our people?
That's a very good question. Yep. Mm-hmm. Dustin.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that last point, and that's a lot of we are on the internet right now, but that's a lot of what this show, Working Class Revolt, is about. We started it, of just talking about updates, trying to get folks on to talk about, what conditions they're facing. We give labor updates, talking about what conditions our community face, and what we face on the workplace. And I think we need to build independent infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I just mean connections with people, whether it's through text message or whether it's through Zoom meetings, in person. However you can make these connections and be able to reach out those people and organize the people in these either social gatherings for political education, historical education, or actual movements and demonstrations. And we're kind of doing it underground a little bit. We're using the tools we have available, but to the extent to reach as many people as possible. But I think we do got to understand that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, these are the tools of the enemy. And they are primarily out there to push the imperialist agenda. Yep. And that is exactly why we're seeing, I was just banned off of Facebook, first for 3 days and then for 6 days. And I was sharing the image of the Azov battalion holding Nazi flags, Nazi insignia. And I had shared these images hundreds of times before. But now, as things are intensifying, these large monopoly tech giants and corporations are completely unaccountable to any government, not even the capitalist government, let alone a popular government. These are institutions that were founded and funded from their beginnings by the CIA, have direct links with the CIA, have massive amounts of data over everything we do online. We're giving our information directly to our enemies. And I think there's this assumption that we're lulled into this false sense of security, that we live in the West and we have it so well. We have all these great tools and toys to entertain ourselves and connect with people. And we lose sight of the material realities we face and what the media is for and who controls it.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, one of the other things I'm currently involved in, it's the defense of Julian Assange. He's one of ours. He comes from this city, and somebody some of us used to know from before the founding of WikiLeaks. And it's one of the effects have been the massive amount of propaganda through media, through corporate media, has made it very difficult for him. It's one of the things, regardless of what is done against him, the violation of legal norms and all the rest of it, this message got out there that Julian Assange is preys on women. The other one, he's a friend of Donald Trump and hates the Democrats, which is here which means by inference he hates the Labor Party here. Now the bottom line is that was directed against those sections that call themselves left within the various organisations and within the unions, who always jump at this sort of thing. If somebody doesn't like women, it's part of that. I think the problem of identity politics, and I think movements that have been distorted in a way that they become the centre of everything, and you put a label on somebody who might have a slightly different opinion, like you hate women, you're a racist, you're this and you're that, all sorts of things. And on Julian Assange, that's wearing thin now because it's become so obvious. But it's held back people who would normally would have jumped to his defence. And we have a problem because one of the reasons why, for instance, the Labor Party hates Julian Assange and WikiLeaks here is because when he first went to the embassy trying to escape detention, the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, is Prime Minister of Australia, some of the cables are released exposed her role. One of the things one of the problems we've had, again, tying in the US connection, a couple of years ago, WikiLeaks let out some of the leaks, some of the cables they let out were from the US Embassy in Canberra in Australia. And it showed how prospective leaders of a succession of them, prospective leaders of their political parties and would-be prime ministers visited and got approval from the US Embassy before they even told their party. We're talking about the Liberal National Coalition. We're talking about the Labor Party. And exposure, they get approval. They must get approval from the US Embassy first, and then they announce they're going to stand as leaders. And she was one that was particular, who used to call herself part of the left. Now, there's a process of trying to rehabilitate her at the moment by sections of the women's movement say, but she was the first female prime minister and she was a woman, so she must be all right. And we have a huge problem with that. And it's one thing that we must push really strongly, that the problems of society are not misogyny in itself. They are not racism in itself. And one argument, it's not white colonial settler problem. It is class. It is capitalism and imperialism, the form it takes today, and the class struggle that determines all politics. And we've got to put that back on centre stage. And one of the things that's divided a lot of the left to become accomplices is their loss of understanding or refusal to understand this, that it's not these things, but it is the nature of society, capitalism and imperialism and the class struggle that's really the key determinant of everything. Right. I'm not saying these other issues are unimportant. They're very important, but they exist only in that context. And that's been hidden and needs to come back.
Spot on there, and I was just looking at the time too. I've just got a question by Kinky. Julia Gillard. Yes, Julia Gillard was our first female Prime Minister, but how she came into being Prime Minister was a quite back coup against then Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Now, that was back in 2010, I'm led to believe. Yes, there was a few proposals. There was a few forces against Kevin Rudd because there was a proposal having a mining super tax or super profits tax for the mining industry. He was Even though he still supported the US-Australia alliance and all these things, he was getting too close to comfort for those in Washington and that to China. Otherwise, economically and also to a certain degree, wasn't exactly doing as told. So, and there was a few other things at the time happened. So, basically, the call came from the US consulate that night. Yep. To some significant figures in the Labor Party. And what happened, they basically said, get rid of this guy or we'll do it again to you. No worries, leave it with us. They did it. And next day, Julia was our Prime Minister. And the first thing she did was got on the phone to Barack Obama. And she became it. And I never saw something repulsive my whole life. Had just how far up. So she just basically worshipped Barack Obama. And this is the thing about it. And I don't understand why people want to praise her. And that when she was, she gave us industrial legislation, which was watered down. Well, it wasn't a watered down version of work choices, which was a horrible anti-union, anti-working class piece of legislation by the previous Howard government. It was just repackaged again, where if workers dared to take action, they're up for liabilities and fines and many restrictions and that. And basically, I've heard all the excuses why they had to do it. It was a 2008 financial crisis. There's this and that. No, there was no excuses. But basically, it just continued on. It was there to maintain imperialism, US imperialism, and British imperialism to Australia as well. As I said, I'm just way a lot of the time here as well. And thanks, Joe. Just a couple of things before we go.
Could I mention something that you touched on? Because I think you talked about John Howard and work choices. Just for others who don't know, work choices was the title given to a policy basically to get rid of unions in the workplace and substitute industrial agreements with individual contracts. It was a huge push. Some, as I suppose, I'm proud to say, played a fairly prominent role in that. And we built a campaign and worked with the unions and built community organisation, in the localities. And we built a big enough movement. We also developed new strategies to fight employers to get better agreements and so on, very successfully. When election time came, he ended up, and it was quite interesting because I was showing, they had a delegation from the Chinese union movement in town at the time, and they thought it was quite amusing, especially when we went to our union headquarters. They had big screens up and the results, and the second time in history where the Prime Minister lost his own seat. His own people turned on him with everybody else, and they all started blaming him. That's his mates, his fellow in the government. It was all his fault. and that was a chance that we had. Now, when Julia came, Labor came in on a promise of getting rid of that legislation. That's on the basis of this movement, they won an election. And particularly when Julia came in, or Julia, I should say, Julia Gillard, she reneged on that. They had a very watered down minimalist change to that. And in particular, there was another piece of legislation that came. It was directed particularly against the construction unions, the Builders Labourers Federation attack continuing. And that set up a special tribunal where not only officials, workers, for not being polite to their employer, basically, not being polite to their employer or polite enough, would be hauled before a tribunal, kind of, like a court, but they had no right of legal defense. And they had no right, the refusal to answer a question, particularly one that incriminates, was punishable by 6 months imprisonment. And they kept that. They kept that going. And it's become less workable because, thankfully, enough workers and officials who've been brought up before that, what they call the Star Chamber, have refused to talk. Generally, nobody talks now. So they said, all right, jail me for 6 months and see what happens. And so it's held that back. But it's made it very difficult because an organizer going into a workplace to visit their members can be arrested. They have no right of entry. They have to meet them outside of work. And it makes life very difficult. Now, that union's been used and it's still being used as the battering ram to extend that through the whole union movement, to turn every workplace into a non-unionized organization, every worker being turned effectively into subcontractor where they've got no protection.
Yep.
So that's still the agenda. And I think we're going to have a lot more of this coming up in the near future, because one of the effects of this shift has been, I know it's part of the neoliberalism thing, but I think it's the way the system's generated that I think nearly 40% of our workforce is now in casualised work. Not proper wages, working overtime for nothing quite often. And the big push is to extend this even further. We have largely deindustrialized. So there are all kinds of things going on. Young people, invariably, if they want a job, they get a job, if they can get one, with rotten conditions in the service sector.
Yep.
And this is the brave new world we've entered into. Thankfully, there are some of these workers. Just the other week, Uber motorcycle riders delivering stuff started organising themselves. In other areas, they were organising themselves. Some of the cafes and restaurants, they were organising themselves. So that is starting to happen, and they're becoming. And I think there are a couple of unions are recruiting some of those people as well, and it's the young people who are leading.
That's refreshing,
and that's a tremendous development. But we've still got a long way to go.
Yeah, but it's refreshing hearing that as well. For once, look, I'm aware of time. Dust, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I think we're getting near the end of it. Maybe if I could just kind of do a closing statement of, kind of round things out a bit. Thank you so much, Joe, for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us.
Right.
I think some of the themes we're going over is really the reemergence of materialism and the reemergence of working class power itself. There's been this time period, kind of like during the Second International in Lenin's time, that Lenin raged against because they supported World War One. Very similar now, and these time periods where this entity, the synthetic left, is backing NATO against I believe to be an anti-imperialist country. Russia is linked with Syria, is allied with Venezuela, has been helping these countries to maintain their sovereignty and give them space to develop by fighting against our main enemy, which is imperialism, monopoly capitalism. And we need to we need to look through the lies, the way they twist our very own issues against us. The struggle for women's rights, the struggle for for gay folks, the struggle for oppressed nations to have full liberation and to improve their own material conditions has been twisted in a social way to support the entities that are facilitating and carrying out and profiting from this oppression. So and they've been able to. They destroyed the communist parties, our power, political and economic power of workers. They've destroyed our unions, and they've destroyed our very culture. I'm thinking about, country music is very near and dear to me. And it used to be, I think, in the 70s or even the 80s in a lot of rural areas. You'd have your local country band, and they play for the people. And each little town had their own type of sound. And it was replaced by this corporate, commercial, just a few country bands. You can see this with other types of music. And there's been a bit of a revolution in the country music scene in recent years. The reemergence of outlaw country, the reemergence of neo-traditional country, with figures like Sturgill Simpson and Chris Stapleton, a return to the bluesy jazz rock and localized vocals like Sturgill Simpson with the strong Kentucky accent, which was really wiped off the country music scene. And we're seeing a reemergence of that, and I'm cheering it on. Just like you said, the young folks are doing these wildcat unions. We need a reemergence of working class power and the power of oppressed nations to reassert themselves, build their own institutions that can take care of their communities and push out our enemies, the monopoly capitalists and imperialists.
Yep, and that's right. Well, thanks for that comment too. And look, we're certainly, for us here in Australia, we certainly have a long way to go. And like it was just originally said by one of the viewers here, this is not a marathon. This is a, this is sorry, no, it's not a sprint.
No, it's not a sprint. It's a marathon.
Yeah. So I got that wrong. Yeah, it's not a sprint. This is a marathon. And I think we've all got a long way to go. But even that, people will be start questioning, especially as material conditions worsen here as well. People's thinking and views on things will start changing a lot more. They'll be thinking, hang on, something's not right here. We've been told all this, and no, something's gone wrong completely here. Well, look, I'm going to wind that up for tonight. Look, thank you once again, Joe, for participating. And for those of you who are interested, I should have put it in the comments section. Links for Australians for a New Democracy. We do have a YouTube channel for that as well. Please go on to that, and I think it's got the website details there as well. We meet regularly as an organising committee every Monday or Sunday, just for an hour, discuss what we're going to do, because we're up to some very exciting new videos coming on. And also too, I like to also acknowledge Joe's work with Latin American Solidarity Network, and also LIFE, which is Living Incomes for Everyone. You can actually find that on Facebook. It's an excellent campaign about that as well. I think they're doing something about a strong pension system again. So that's just one of many. I'll probably be here all day announcing the list. Probably be about 30 miles long. But look, thank you for again having us on the show. And look, was also too a big shout out to the viewers today for coming on. Look, please please subscribe, please, hit the notifications button as well. And also, I want to be a special big shout out to the Center of Political Innovations Anti-Imperialist Conference in Austin, Texas, currently happening at the moment. I've seen a few pictures on Facebook. I wish you guys went live, but look, I can understand why you probably didn't have to do it. But I'm looking forward to videos and all the information coming out of there as well. So look, repeat after me. We usually close the show by raising our fists in the air, and I'll do it this time. So repeat after me. Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Yes, dare to win.
Dare to win.
All power to the people.
All power to the people.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Good night.